The thing I remember most clearly is the sound. Not the crack, not the fall, not even my brother-in-law's voice saying "oops" the way you say it when you bump a glass off a counter. It was my sister's laugh. High and bright and completely unbothered, like what had just happened was the funniest thing she'd seen all year. I was on the kitchen floor with my wrist bent the wrong direction, and she was laughing. That was 3 days before I ended up in the ER with a surgeon staring at my x-ray like it had personally offended him. 3 days before he set down the image, turned to me slowly, and said, "How long has this been going on?" I didn't know how to answer that. I wasn't even sure what this referred to. I thought I was there for my wrist. I wasn't. My sister's name is Kendall. She's 4 years older than me, which means she had 4 years to become the person she is before I showed up, and, according to her, ruined everything. She never said that out loud. She didn't need to. You learn to read the language of a person who resents you before you're old enough to have words for what you're reading. Growing up, it always looked like an accident. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about siblings like Kendall. It never looks like what it is. She tripped me on the stairs when I was 7 and told our mom I'd been running. She slammed my hand in the car door when I was 11 and said I wasn't paying attention. She pushed me off the back porch swing when I was 14 and I landed wrong on my shoulder, and the whole family agreed I'd always been clumsy. I agreed too, for a long time. That's the part that gets me now. I genuinely believed I was just clumsy. When you grow up being told a story about yourself, you start to tell it too. The graduation parties was my mom's idea. I'd finished my master's degree, the first in our family, and my mom wanted to celebrate properly. She booked out the back patio of her house, ordered too much food, invited people I barely knew from her church group. It was exactly the kind of party I wouldn't have planned for myself, but I smiled through it because it made her happy, and because I had spent 31 years learning that keeping the peace was easier than the alternative. Kendall was there with her husband, my brother-in-law, who I will call what he is, someone who has spent 7 years enabling my sister because it is easier than disagreeing with her. He laughed when she laughed. He looked away when she did things that needed witnessing. He was very good at being in the wrong direction at the right moment. The evening went fine for about 2 hours. That's usually how long it takes before Kendall finds her footing at family events. She needs to survey the room first. Figure out who's paying attention to her, who's paying attention to me, recalibrate from there. I was standing near the dessert table talking to my mom's neighbor, a woman named Harriet who I'd known my whole life and who had always been kind to me, when Kendall walked over with a piece of cake on a plate. "Here," she said, smiling the way she smiles in photos. "You have to try this, it's incredible." I turned toward her. She shoved it into my face. Not handed it to me, not playfully tapped it, shoved, 2 hands, full force, ceramic plate included. I went backward, my heel caught the leg of the table. My arm went out to catch myself, and when my wrist hit the ground, I heard something I can only describe as a wet snap. Kendall laughed. Her husband laughed. A few people nearby went completely still. My mom said, "Oh, Kendall," in the tired voice she uses for things she has decided not to deal with. I sat on the ground for a moment, trying to figure out if what I was feeling in my wrist was pain or something past pain. It turned out to be the second one. "It was just a joke," Kendall said. She was already wiping frosting off her hands with a napkin. "You're so dramatic." I got up. I went inside. I cleaned the cake off my face in the bathroom mirror and looked at the way my wrist was sitting and decided I'd deal with it in the morning. That was my first mistake. My second was not leaving the party immediately. I stayed another hour because I didn't want to make a scene and because some part of me, the part that had been trained for 31 years, still believed that leaving would be the rude thing to do. By morning, my wrist was the size of a small eggplant and the color of a thunderstorm. I drove myself to the ER because there was no one I wanted to call. That sounds sadder than I mean it to. I had friends. I had people. But explaining why I needed a ride to the hospital because my sister shoved cake in my face felt like a sentence I couldn't finish without it coming out wrong. So I drove myself, left-handed the whole way, and sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes watching a children's cartoon on the ceiling-mounted TV because it was the only thing on, and I couldn't look anywhere that required moving my neck without something pulling. The triage nurse took one look at my wrist and moved me faster than I expected. The ER doctor who came in was a man I'd put in his mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of calm that comes from seeing too many things. He introduced himself, asked me what happened, and I told him the short version: fell at a party, landed wrong. He examined my wrist carefully, ordered x-rays, and then left me alone with the hum of the fluorescent light for about 20 minutes. When he came back, he was holding the images and he wasn't looking at me yet. He was looking at the film. He put it up on the light panel on the wall, and I watched his expression change in the way that expressions change when someone is working very hard to keep them neutral. "Can I ask you something?" he said, still looking at the x-ray. "Sure." He turned around. "This fracture in your wrist, it's a fresh break, consistent with what you described. But I'm also seeing an old healed fracture in the same bone, and when we did the initial imaging, we caught part of your shoulder. There's a healed injury there too." He paused. "These aren't unusual individually, but together, and given your age and overall health, I'd like to understand the history." I didn't say anything. "How did the shoulder happen?" he asked. "I fell off a swing when I was 14. He nodded, made a note. "And the previous wrist injury?" "Car door," I said. "When I was a kid." He looked at me for a long moment. Not unkindly. The way someone looks at you when they're trying to deduce whether you're telling the full truth or the only truth you know how to tell. "Is there anything else you want to tell me about last night?" he said. And something in the way he asked, not accusatory, not clinical, just open, like he was leaving a door and deciding whether I'd walk through it, made me start talking. I told him about the cake. I told him it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I told him about the porch swing and the car door and the stairs, and the way my family had always translated Kendall's violence into my clumsiness with a fluency that amazed me, even now. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Okay, I'm going to step out for a few minutes. We're going to get your wrist set, and then someone else is going to want to talk to you." "A detective," he said. "The hospital has a mandatory reporting protocol for injuries that indicate a pattern of harm. What you've described, and what I'm seeing on these images, meets that threshold." He said it matter-of-factly, like it was a thing that happened in the course of regular days, which I suppose for him it was. For me, it felt like the floor had shifted 2 inches to the left. They set my wrist and put it in a soft cast while we waited. A woman came in about an hour later. "Detective Nolan," she said, from the family violence unit. She had short dark hair and a messenger bag that looked like it belonged to someone who graded papers, not someone who worked violent crimes, and she sat in the chair next to my bed and took out a notebook and asked me to tell her everything from the beginning. I told her I wasn't sure where the beginning was. She said, "Wherever it feels like it starts." So I started at 14. The porch swing, my shoulder. The way my mom had said, "You've always been clumsy. You know how you are," while the ER doctor at the time wrapped my arm, and my sister stood in the corner of the room, looking completely untroubled. Detective Nolan wrote things down and asked quiet questions, and occasionally looked up at me with the particular expression of someone who was not surprised but was still paying very close attention. She asked, "Did anyone witness last night's incident?" she asked. "At least 8 people," I said, "including my mother. Would any of them corroborate what you've described?" I thought about Harriet, my mom's neighbor. I thought about the way she'd stood completely still when it happened, the way she'd looked at Kendall and then looked at me on the floor and pressed her lips together. "Yes," I said. "I think so." "Okay." Detective Nolan closed her notebook. "I want to be straightforward with you about a few things. We're going to look into this. The hospital documentation is useful. Your account is useful. Witness accounts would be useful. But I also want to be honest with you. What happens next depends on a lot of factors, including whether you want to pursue this formally. What does formally mean? Charges, a case, potentially a restraining order, depending on what the investigation finds. I had never said the word charges in relation to my sister before. It felt strange in my mouth, even as a concept. For 31 years, I had been working so hard to not make things into what they were. What would the charges be? I asked. At minimum, battery. Given the pattern and the documented injuries, potentially more. She paused. I understand this involves family. I'm not going to tell you what to decide. But I want you to know that what happened to you is not something you're obligated to absorb quietly. She said it plainly. No inflection, no performance, just the sentence, sitting in the air. I thought about my wrist. I thought about being 14 on the ground underneath the porch swing while my shoulder bent in the wrong direction. I thought about driving myself to the hospital this morning because I didn't know how to explain it to anyone without the explanation sounding like an accusation, and how absurd that was, and how long I had been carrying the weight of other people's actions as though they were my own embarrassments to manage. I want to pursue it formally, I said. My mom arrived about an hour later. I don't know who called her. Probably the front desk when I filled out the intake form. I'd listed her as my emergency contact out of habit, a years-old muscle memory I hadn't thought to update. I was going to update it after this. She came in with her coat still half on, and when she saw my wrist in the cast, she made a sound that I recognized as genuine distress. My mom was not a villain. That was the complicated part. She loved me. She also loved Kendall in a way that had always required a certain amount of willful ignorance, and for 31 years, those two things had coexisted in her in a way I didn't fully understand. What happened? She said. They said it was serious. My wrist is broken, I said. Kendall broke it. It was an accident. She shoved a plate into my face with both hands and I fell backward, I said. That's not an accident. And there's a detective involved now because the doctor found old healed injuries and reported it. My mom went very still. Mom, I said, I need you to actually hear me right now. She sat down in the chair by the bed, the chairs Detective Nolan had been sitting in, and she looked at her hands in her lap and she didn't say anything for a long time. Outside in the hallway, someone was being moved somewhere, wheels on linoleum, voices, and then it went quiet again. I've always known she was hard on you, my mom said finally. Her voice was smaller than usual. Hard on me, I repeated. I didn't think. I never thought it was. What did you think it was? She didn't answer. And I realized, sitting there with a broken wrist and frosting still faintly in my hairline, that she probably didn't have an answer. That she had spent 31 years actively choosing not to think about what it was, and that the absence of thinking had felt to her like neutrality. But from where I was sitting, it looked like a 31-year-long permission slip. I told her that, not unkindly, but clearly the way Detective Nolan had spoken to me, plainly, without performance. My mom cried. I didn't. I'd already spent a lot of years crying about things that hadn't been named yet, and now that they had names, I found I was mostly just tired. The investigation took 6 weeks. Detective Nolan was thorough. She spoke to Harriet, who confirmed what she'd seen at the party without any hesitation. Harriet, who had apparently been waiting for someone to ask her for years. She tracked down the records from my shoulder at 14, the documentation from my wrist at 11 that had been written off as a car door incident, an old pediatric record from when I was 9 that listed a bruised rib as row housing. She built a file. She also spoke to Kendall, who denied everything, then admitted to the cake incident but called it a joke, then said I was emotionally unstable and prone to exaggeration, which is a sentence my sister had been constructing about me for three decades, so it came out of her mouth very smoothly. It didn't matter as much as Kendall thought it would. Evidence has a way of speaking louder than character testimony from the person being accused. Kendall was charged with battery and 1 count of intentional infliction of bodily harm. Her lawyer negotiated. The final outcome was a guilty plea to the battery charge, a fine, 2 years of probation, and a mandatory restraining order keeping her 100 yards from me at all times. I know some people think that's not enough. I read comments sometimes and I understand the instinct. She should have gone to jail. The system let her off. Probation is a joke. I've thought about that too. But I also want to say this as clearly as I can. For someone who spent 31 years being told her own experiences weren't real, standing in a room where the documented evidence of those experiences was read aloud in legal language, and a judge called them findings of fact, that did something to me. That fixed something I hadn't known how to fix on my own. The restraining order fixed the rest. My mom and I talk differently now. Not easily. I don't want to suggest it got easy, because it didn't. There are things she said and didn't say and allowed and ignored that I still work through, usually with my therapist on Tuesday afternoons, sometimes alone on the drive home from work. But something shifted in her in that hospital room. I saw it happen, the way Detective Nolan's words, and then my words, landed somewhere in her that she couldn't redirect. She stopped saying Kendall was hard on me. She started saying what Kendall did to me, and I don't know if she understands how different those two sentences are, but they're different. She comes to dinner on the first Sunday of every month now, just the two of us, and we are building something that is smaller and more honest than what we had before. I think that might be better. I think things that are smaller and honest are almost always better than things that are large and built on silence. I moved across the city 6 months ago. New apartment, 3rd floor, lots of windows. I haven't spoken to Kendall since the night of the party. I don't intend to. The restraining order makes that easy in the logistical sense, but I want to be honest and say that even without it, I think I was done. I think I had been done for a long time and had simply not yet given myself permission to say so. I give myself permission for a lot of things now. It's strange how much space opens up when you stop spending all of it managing someone else's behavior. I have a wrist that aches in cold weather and a shoulder that catches sometimes when I reach overhead, and I have a life that is, for the first time in memory, fully my own. I used to think I was clumsy. I'm not. I never was. I was just in proximity to someone who needed me to believe that I was, and I'm not anymore.